On the 17th of January 1940, a meeting took place between Hitler, General Erich von Manstein, and the commander of a panzer division, Erwin Rommel. They discussed plans to push through the Ardennes and invade France. Hitler was attracted to the surprise attack and agreed to the proposition.
When one looks at the Blitzkrieg through the Ardennes, Guderian said to his troops, "I expect you to go without sleep for 3 days." Now, 3 days in a tank in an armoured fighting vehicle during the early days of summer, but it happened to be extremely hot, would have tested anyone's resilience. Drugs, therefore, seen as legitimate and legitimised by the regime, were a very good source of energy and stimulus during a very difficult period.
For this push to be successful, the army would have to drive for days without stopping and without sleeping.
Now, Pervitin, well, that's a miracle drug, because what that means is our guys don't have to rest. They can just keep going. They can do a forced march through the Ardennes forest for 3 days and just keep going. They don't need to sleep. What an advantage that is, because if speed of maneuver is what it's all about, speed and your ability to keep going are absolutely crucial elements of what you're trying to achieve.
On the 10th of May 1940, Pervitin was taken in the millions. German propaganda often depicted Germany's quick victory due to the morale of the National Socialists, but in reality, Panzer Troop unit drivers were taking 2 to 5 Pervitin tablets a day to ensure they didn't sleep and they didn't stop.
Berlin was very cheap in the 20s. The economy was very bad. The state was not very strong. Germany had lost the First World War.
One also saw a reaction, really, against the defeat. They were trying to escape it, and that's why drugs played such a large part.
Life in Germany after the end of the First World War was incredibly difficult initially, and that's in those first years, that's when you've got kind of wheelbarrows of cash, hyperinflation, massive unemployment and a lot of civil unrest as well. But as the 20s develop, and so Germany starts to get itself back on the tracks again.
There was a feeling of uncertainty, but also a sense of anything is possible, a sense of let's experiment, let's try out new things politically, culturally, socially. So especially in Berlin, it was a very open and free time.
This is where they were having these incredible nightclubs and cabarets and so on. This was a place where you could have free love, you could take drugs, you could drink as much as you like, you could take heroin, basically do anything you wanted.
So I guess Berlin acquired its own kind of flavor, or at least reputation, for being sexually open, promiscuous place where anything goes.
And that decadency led to great military inspiration, but also great political and social change.
Heil, Arbeitswelle! Heil, Heil, Führer!
Manufacturing drugs was an important part of the German pharmaceutical economy and the German economy as a whole. That started in the 19th century when a German chemist actually extracted morphine from opium, from poppy seed, and made pharmaceutical development possible in a way. In the Versailles Treaty, there was a sub-treaty that Germany had to sign, which would disable the German economy to continue manufacturing the drugs with which they made so much money. So German economy desperately tries to continue producing cocaine, heroin, morphine, and was the world supplier actually at the time for these drugs.
And if you haven't got the resources yourself, then what you tend to do is strive that little bit harder to kind of find alternatives. So it's no surprise that the pharmaceutical industry is absolutely at the forefront.
The Germans invented methadone because they couldn't get access to the opium, poppy and morphine. So they invented their own forms of morphine and heroin in order to help deal with pain, but also calm people.
It led to them developing new drugs with new inspiration from the military. And there were new linkages between the needs of perhaps an expanding nation militarily and the way in which the pharmaceutical industry could help that desire.
Pervitin was developed by the Temmler company in Berlin after the Olympic Games 1936. They were not sure what Pervitin is good for, so they basically thought it's good for everything.
So Pervitin is developed and it's methamphetamine. The whole point of it is it's pain relief, but it's also to stop you sleeping. How boring is sleeping? It stops you working. We've got a new Germany to build. We want people to work really, really hard. And this is a way where you can counteract the biggest problem of human endeavor, which is the need to sleep and rest. If you can take a pill that cuts that out, how fantastic is that?
We can see how popular methamphetamine actually was when we look at a chocolate that the Hildebrand company put on the market. It was a box of chocolates and each little portion contained 13 milligrams of methamphetamine. It was also stressed that you even lose weight while eating that sweet because methamphetamine is a slimming agent. You're not hungry anymore when you're on meth. The ads at the time show a very happy German Fräulein or Hausfrau grabbing into the box and taking one of these chocolates.
I mean, it's worth remembering all drugs were either prescription drugs or freely available at that point in Germany, right? Leading up to that point, there had been no prohibition of drugs. There was no such concept in Germany at that time. There had never been any banned drugs. So they just didn't think in those terms.
The newest findings by brain scientists show that there is a mechanism in our brain that inhibits us from killing. And there's ways to get around that mechanism. And using certain synthetic stimulants such as methamphetamine are an effective way of bypassing that inhibition to kill. Armies have always taken drugs in order to influence the outcome of war, in order to improve their fighting capabilities. And methamphetamine is a very potent substance. So it certainly has a very strong effect on the individual soldier. And if we have millions of soldiers on methamphetamine, it will have a definite effect on the outcome of battles and of whole campaigns. Heinrich Hoffmann was an old friend of Hitler. They knew each other from the 20s. Hoffmann was a photographer in Munich, and he became Hitler's official photographer. He would do most of the portraits of Hitler that we know, and published photo books of Hitler that became bestsellers actually in Nazi Germany, showing Hitler's private life, showing him in the mountains, looking into the distance and kind of stylizing Hitler as the good dictator, the father of the German nation.
Morell's treatment of Hoffmann was obviously a key step in his introduction to Hitler. Without Hoffmann, he'd never have met Hitler. He'd never have become Hitler's personal physician.
And Hoffmann also played quite an important role in Hitler's private life, you could say, because he introduced Eva Braun to Hitler. Eva Braun was working for him. She was 19 at the time. She was his assistant in his photo lab. So he brought the two together. And he brought another person to Hitler, which was Theo Morell, because in 1936, Hoffmann was suffering from gonorrhea, and Morell treated him. And after the successful treatment, Hoffmann arranged a dinner at his private house in Munich, where Hitler also was present, and Eva Braun was present, and Morell was there. And then Morell and Hitler started talking. Hitler told Morell that he's suffering from stomach cramps and his regular doctors can't cure that. And then Morell suggested his probiotic medicine called Mutaflor. Mutaflor was, and I suppose is, because it's still on the market, a medicine containing active live bacteria. So Hitler received that probiotic remedy that was able to kill enough of his bad flora that he actually got over his problems and then started believing that Morell is the guy who has the right medicines.
Theodor Morell was Hitler's personal physician, and increasingly Hitler came to rely on him not only as a doctor that pretty much prescribed whatever Hitler required, he was also his confidant.
Morell had a very successful practice in the center of Berlin, right on Kurfürstendamm, which is the main boulevard. He was expensive. He was known to treat diseases that don't exist. His patients loved him. Maybe because of the strong drugs he gave them, but he seems to have been like a jovial character. He was popular with celebrities in the German capital. He was popular with actors and actresses that had to go on stage and maybe experience stage fright. He would give them an injection that made them feel confident. So he was a type of Dr. Feelgood. So he had a career. That's why his wife criticized him when he took the job as Hitler's personal physician. She said, we don't need that. You can stay in Berlin. Practice is going well. Why would you do that? Because in the beginning, actually, Hitler paid him quite a low salary, but he loved the power of treating the most powerful man in Europe.
Theodor Morell is essentially a quack. I mean, he is a trained doctor, but he's into alternative means of medicine. He manages to unveil his way into Hitler's inner circle and then becomes completely indispensable. I mean, so much so that kind of Hitler barely can exist a day without Morell kind of, ingesting him with a whole cocktail of drugs. It's Hitler's dependency on him that ensures that Morell stays in that inner circle and stays having that incredible influence. There are others around, but it is Morell who is above all as the war progresses, and the stress and physical and mental strain on Hitler comes greater. So Morell's influence becomes greater.
The generals were always hugely suspicious of Morell right from the start. That he seemed to have so much influence over Hitler, that he was there the whole time. He was, to put it mildly, a very unprepossessing character.
He was very much a medical man, a doctor. He always wanted to be a military man. When he became personal physician of Hitler, he felt ridiculous being the only one in the headquarters without a uniform, and he reacted in a way that's a bit comical, actually. He started making his own fantasy uniform that looked like a military uniform, and that made him even more ridiculous within inner circles, because military men obviously immediately realized that this is a uniform that he made up, and made fun of him. He put the SS runes onto his label. The SS immediately said, "You have to take them off, you're not a member of the SS." So he was never accepted by any military organization, and Hitler actually liked that, because that meant that he had full control over Morell, that Morell had no powerful organization behind him.
The time that they spent together was very important, and Morell's impact on Hitler was undoubtedly quite significant during that period.
The core of the National Socialist ideology stands the purity of the blood. Hitler represented, or was supposed to represent, the whole nation. So his body, in a way, is the symbol for what the Nazis called the Volkskörper, the people's body. They saw the nation as one body, and Hitler was the representation of that body. Even the greeting Heil Hitler, in a way, refers to the health of Hitler, because Heil in German also means being healthy. So to show Hitler as this clean and healthy teetotaler was of utmost importance to the cult that the Nazi Party created around him.
Well, Hitler's movement very much depended on the idea of regeneration. which meant clean living, which meant the whole of their art, which was sort of produced, the Nazi art, was, you know, the perfect naked body through athletics, through clean living. So for Hitler to in any way vary from what he pretended to be his self-denial, no alcohol, no smoking, and in fact, of course, no meat, but we soon found that he, of course, was being injected with substances which were probably far worse.
A series of new legislation, such as the 1935 Nuremberg race law, condemned drug users, Jews and homosexuals alike, suggesting that they were toxic for the country's welfare.
The Nazis, in a way, invented the war on drugs when they prohibited drug use after they took power. So they used their drug policies early on to control the population and to especially oppress minorities like the Jewish minority in Germany by calling them drug users and saying that many drugs are particularly used by Jews.
Young medical officers started to become obsessed with the performance-enhancing meth-based pill, stocking up on the drug in preparation for the Poland deployment. Many of Hitler's soldiers didn't realize it was a powerful drug and considered it to be an alternative to coffee.
For the first time, Pervitin was used when German troops marched into the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia. And the first time it was used on a massive scale was in the attack against Poland.
Well, the head of defense mechanism, Professor Dr. Ranke, had not really planned it to be used, but he had allowed a certain amount or given a certain amount to medical officers who then distributed it within their regiments. They realized that actually Pervitin could have a tremendous effect in the way that the tank crews could keep going when normally they would have to stop and relax and sleep and rest and so forth.
Otto Ranke was the head of the Institute for Defense Physiology. In 1938, Ranke realized that there was a medicine out there which might help him fight his two main enemies, and those were fear and fatigue, and that medicine was Pervitin. Well, he was like the father of Pervitin in the Wehrmacht, so he was in a way responsible for performance enhancement for the German army.
I think Pervitin obviously had more effects than just a purely physical one. I mean, the way that it gave such confidence, aggression too, it seems, from some of the studies. It produced a sense of euphoria, which meant, of course, that they were less susceptible to cowardice or to fear. And this made a huge difference to surprising the enemy.
So the soldiers didn't need to be brainwashed. There was no sense of negative effects by taking Pervitin. Everyone loved it, and everyone felt good taking it. So you would just take it every day and you would always feel good. And there was no realization in the beginning that you actually become addicted and that tolerance builds up and that it might have negative side effects. That only came to light later on.
Well, the problem with any drug is that at some point you've got to stop taking it because otherwise you're going to die. I mean, you just can't keep taking drugs forever. It raises your heartbeat, your heart's going to explode, your head's going to explode. You know, they're obviously not good for you, particularly methamphetamine.
However, if you keep taking it day after day after day after day, there's no respite. You can't sleep. The effects build up, and eventually become paranoid and a bit stereotyped.
The most dangerous and pernicious effect of methamphetamine by far is that it suppresses sleep. Human beings sleep for a very good reason. We need to be replenished, we need to process what we've seen. If you have protracted periods without sleep, what happens is the kind of dreaming world starts to bleed into the waking world. So that's where you start to experience a deterioration in your mental health, because you lose the ability, you increasingly lose the ability to distinguish between the waking world and the dreaming world.
And there are several difficult questions about drug use in wartime. I mean, one of them is, does it change people's behaviour so they kind of lose their moral compass? And I think it can in some ways. Once you get paranoid, then you start to think differently. So you've lost control of your normal rational faculties. Also, if you're completely out of it, so that you're so high that you kind of don't know what you're doing, then you may well do things in war that you regret the same way as when people get out of it in non-war time, they regret what they do. So those are two independent variables which can both contribute to people doing things which they really would prefer not to have done.
I think the drugs that Hitler took made him bolder. They made him perhaps carry out certain decisions that he may not otherwise have done. He certainly felt that at certain times he needed that extra stimulus, particularly earlier in the war, to continue the increasingly difficult daily working hours that he had to cope with. I think that the Nazi regime had a completely different culture, and the culture of drug taking in the Nazi high command was something that was recognized, if not understood. A large number of the Nazi hierarchy were very much dependent upon drugs. I think interestingly, a number of them were actually quite shy individuals, and it allowed them to come out of themselves, be more charismatic, be more perhaps authoritarian. But increasingly, those drugs were becoming heavier, more potent, and really did undermine their ability to make clear decisions.
There's a danger in the way some people have talked about the Nazi drug use, because some people have presented this as if it's saying, well, the Nazis were just off their face on drugs, they were just out of it, and therefore we don't have to look at their genocidal ideology, their monstrous characters and so on. There's a real danger in the role of drugs in the Third Reich are very real. They did play a factor, but I think there's a real danger in overstating the moral nature of what happened. Methamphetamine, like other drugs like caffeine, like alcohol, they are tools to achieve goals. The methamphetamine is just a tool to help you be better at your goal. It's not the driver of the morality of your act.
Hitler, we know, had a number of underlying difficulties, what we would call today as personality disorder. He had, the maniacal fantasies he had weren't as a result of his drug misuse. These were already in place from his childhood. In many ways, the pharmaceuticals he was being prescribed may well have been medicating against some of the effects of his predisposing personality.
The German Blitzkrieg of 1940 was so named because it was very fast.
The original idea of Blitzkrieg really came from Guderian's book, published in 1937, called Achtung Panzer, which basically means look out, tank. The idea that you can break through with a combination of tanks and aircraft and so astonish your enemy that they don't know what to do.
Heinz Guderian was called the Fast Heinz. He was one of these avant-garde thinking, if you will, panzer generals, and was responsible for developing the Blitzkrieg strategy.
One of the greatest challenges of all for the Germans is the need for speed. And because of the resource-poor nature of Germany, because of their geographical isolation and their limited access to the world's resources, the Germans and the Prussians before them have always, their way of war is to completely overwhelm their enemy very, very quickly by rapid maneuver.
This was what they achieved on the 10th of May when they came through the Eifel, from the Eifel through the Ardennes in southern Belgium and into France. And when those tanks kept going, once they'd made their breakthrough, the French were completely flabbergasted and unable to react.
Communications are vital in any battle, but when one is trying to plan and execute a fast-moving battle with armoured fighting vehicles, they become all the more important, because the distances that are being travelled on various fronts are going to be far greater, certainly than in the First World War. And one of the great reasons why in 1918 the British Army was limited in their range was because they didn't have mobile field radios. Heinz Guderian and others was at the centre of the demand that the German armed forces should develop and should use small radios that could be put into armoured fighting vehicles.
The strategy was decided on February 17, 1940, during a breakfast in the Reichschancellery. 3 tank generals, Rommel, Guderian, and von Manstein, were having this meeting with Hitler. They said we should go through the Ardennes Mountains, using tanks as the decisive force to move ahead. But basically the Ardennes Mountains were like a tight window through which the German army could squeeze through, but the Western Allies thought this would be impossible because you can't move tanks quickly through the mountains. But this is exactly what they proposed, and Hitler said, this is how we're going to do it. And Ranke suddenly was being invited to give talks about pervitin in front of generals and to explain how methamphetamine could be used, because time was the decisive factor. Ranke was also asked to write the so-called stimulant decree, detailing how the German troops should actually take methamphetamine once the attack starts.
Pervitin, this methamphetamine which they had produced, in 35 million doses, which is astonishing, was distributed, but particularly to the panzer troops, with the armoured troops at the front. The tank troops were totally exhausted after taking Pervitin over several days. Well, once they had broken through, and once they had basically cut off the British at Dunkirk, then they did have time on their hands. Apart from anything else, they also needed time to service their vehicles, after the distance they had travelled. So the two, in a way, went together.
So if you were taking, for instance, methamphetamine for 3 or 4 days, as in the Ardennes offensive, then it would take you 2 or 3 days to restabilise your normal sleep-wake cycle.
And so we see the 7th Panzer Division making the most extraordinary strides forward, being known by Hitler as the Ghost Division, not necessarily just because the enemy didn't know where they were, but because he didn't know where they were. Rommel was pushing the boundaries of what armoured fighting vehicles could achieve, and the men that drove those machines could achieve, and drugs undoubtedly would have been a part of that success.
So from that point of view, it was definitely a breakthrough in the use of drugs in warfare.
The problem was that when France surrendered in third week of June 1940, Britain didn't surrender too. And Germany knew that Britain had to be knocked out of the war before it could think about regaining its strength and then turning its attention to the east. But the Battle of Britain is an aerial battle that wages over southern Britain predominantly throughout the summer months of 1940, and the Luftwaffe fails spectacularly.
Due to night operations, the German pilots took Pervitin tablets to stay awake, many of them taking off their breathing masks to shove their faces with the pills. Although the Germans were using performance-enhancing drugs during the Battle of Britain, they couldn't defeat the Royal Air Force and suffered their first major defeat in the war. Thereafter, Operation Sea Lion was called off.
Operation Sea Lion was the German project to invade Britain after the fall of France. Hitler had hoped, of course, that Britain would want to make peace, and this is why, in fact, it was the one moment in the whole war when Germany could have won. And it was when Churchill refused to have any form of negotiation at that moment when the British army was trapped in Dunkirk and nobody really knew what the future would hold. But Hitler's idea of a cross-channel invasion was never entirely convincing, because although they created and collected these sort of barges to take the soldiers across, the strength of the British Navy, the Royal Navy, was still very great indeed. And he really said, we will only do it if Goering can actually destroy the Royal Air Force, because without air power, the Royal Navy would have been vulnerable.
Operation Sea Lion is the planned invasion of southeast Britain by the Germans. And the interesting thing about it is what a complete mess the whole plan was, because Germany was the only nation in the world that had a combined general staff, which was the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and yet they didn't make the most of that. So what happened was, when Hitler was preparing for dealing with Britain in July 1940, he retreated to his country home in the mountains, the Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, the Berghof, and asked all his service chiefs to come and visit him one by one. There's absolutely no combined operations planning. There's no joined up thinking whatsoever. They haven't got, even through the first line of defences by September 1940, which is the RAF, they haven't got through the second line at all, which is the Royal Navy and mines and all the rest of it in the shipping. Nor have they even got close to coming up against the third line of defence, which of course is the soldiers on the ground, which can mount to about 2.5 million by that point. So they are very, very long way off from ever happening. And if you think about the jeopardy that faced the Allies for Operation Overlord, D-Day in June 1944, and you think how many things had to be in place before that could even be considered to be a goer, complete control of airspace, control of the seas, all the rest of it, complete control of intelligence networks, and winning the espionage war, none of that was in place in 1940. And there was quite a lot of jeopardy for D-Day. So Operation Sea Lion, had it ever been attempted, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever, would have been the biggest disaster the Germans faced up until that point.
The fact that the British are fighting on their home soil, or at least above their home soil. They're fighting for their very survival. The Germans have been fighting in Scandinavia, Poland, the Low Countries, and then France. They are tired. They are ready to pack their bags, have some rest and recuperation, starting a whole new campaign at this point, which is something that was really pushing them a little bit too far.
The Germans thought that they were inferior when it came to technology and also training of their pilots, so they tried to make up for it by giving the Luftwaffe pilots methamphetamine, Pervitin, so they could fly more missions and longer missions.
The lack of success of the Luftwaffe is interesting. Was it down to Pervitin? Were their pilots, overly medicated? Or is the explanation just the superiority of the technology of the Spitfire?
To begin with, they attacked the airfields to destroy the fighter command. And that actually started to present a real danger. But British aircraft production was much higher than in Germany. And also, Goering handled his pilots so badly that they were given no rest whatsoever. And so they were given Pervitin to keep them going. But this also led with its side effects of quite often lack of judgment after excessive use of Pervitin and double vision and all these other things. And I think it's one of the great contributory factors to the astonishing level of crashes.
When the British examined German planes that had been shut down over Great Britain, they found Pervitin, and there was a discussion within the Royal Air Force whether Pervitin or methamphetamine should also be used on this side. And tests were being done with British pilots, giving them methamphetamine and amphetamine, and then the decision was made that British pilots should use amphetamines. So in a way, the Nazis started a pharmacological arms race.
Now, in contrast to the Germans and Japanese with their methamphetamine, the Americans and the British use amphetamine sulfate. That's not as strong, and it doesn't last as long. And where it really came to the fore was in the North Africa campaign. So here we are, we're fighting Rommel in North Africa. We've got the desert rats. The desert rats are getting up in the evenings, taking amphetamine sulfate, harrying the Germans through the night. The Germans can't sleep because they're on their crystal meth. They get very confused by what's going on. Brits and the Aussies go back and they sleep in the day because the amphetamine sulfate's worn off. The Germans can't sleep because the methamphetamine continues. So day after day, night after night, the Germans are awake and awake and awake and getting more and more disturbed by the fact that they can't really fight back at night because it's too dark, and they can't sleep in the day.
In February 1941, Conti delivered another warning to the party, explaining that there was an immediate danger to the health and the future of the nation. His message was eventually acknowledged by the Reichsführer, and on the 12th of June 1941, Pervitin was declared to be an intoxicant and made subject to the Reich opium laws.
Leo Conti was the so-called health Führer of the Nazi state, and he was against Pervitin. He made it a prescription-based drug in November 1939, and he made it illegal in the early summer of 1941. But the German Wehrmacht replied to him in a letter saying that this is a law that doesn't really apply to us. We do whatever we want. Well, when an article appeared in the Milano newspaper that the German pilots had been using a so-called pill of courage, which was Pervitin, in order to fight as they were able to fight, there was a discussion in German High Command saying foreign media is now saying we're only so good in fighting because we're using drugs. So this contributed to the controversy within German High Command whether Pervitin should be used, and Conti used that argument saying we have to ban this is against our ideology. The Wehrmacht always said if this is beneficial for our war effort, we are going to use it, and if there is physical harm for certain people, we just cannot take that into account. The overall effort is of most importance.
Although Conti had been successful in banning Pervitin, the Germans barely took any notice of the law. Consumption increased by over 1.5 million units a year. The Wehrmacht decided to develop new miracle weapons. The plan was to launch small-size attacks and surprise the enemy. This mission would require the men to spend several days underwater, and it was decided that they would need something stronger than Pervitin. The search for a new miracle drug began.
The Navy in early 1944 had developed new mini-submarines which were manned by 1 or 2 persons only, and which were basically floating torpedoes. And the idea was to send those mini-submarines all the way up to the Thames estuary and British ports unnoticed. The problem was that these missions would have to last more than 4 days and up to a week, because you couldn't sleep in those mini-submarines. You had to stay awake. So the Navy was looking for new drugs. Well, the Navy had a doctor called Orzechowski, which was responsible for developing this wonder drug that would keep you awake for a week. It was in fact a combination of Eukodal, Hitler's favorite opioid, cocaine, and methamphetamine, which are in a way the 3 most potent drugs in the world, all rolled up into one pill. He recruited 16 to 18-year-old youngsters for these highly dangerous missions. The results were catastrophic.
They started to hallucinate, they felt totally sick, and most of them were completely incapable, so it was a useless sacrifice.
So the Navy thought that they should do proper tests now for their new wonder drug, because they didn't give up on the idea of the wonder drug. And then they started doing tests in the concentration camp of Sachsenhausen. And the shoe runners unit was testing shoe soles for the German shoe industry.
These ghastly tests were done supposedly to try out different forms of the soles of boots for the German army, because of course they didn't have the leather anymore. They needed to have artificial products. And so these poor prisoners, 20 a day, were dying as they were being forced to keep walking, 40 kilometers or more on a totally insufficient diet.
The Navy hired this penalty unit, paid the SS money to be able to use these inmates, and gave them different dosages and different kinds of drugs. And then they had to start walking with backpacks filled with stones. They started at 8 p.m. at night and had to walk all through the night. And then they checked which inmates on which drugs would walk for the longest period of time. And that's how they made the decision which drug would be the best to give to the young German Navy soldiers on their missions against Great Britain.
Morell began giving Hitler more testosterone for his libido and gave Eva Braun medication to suppress menstruation. Hitler and Braun began enjoying an exciting sexual relationship, and Hitler often had to conceal wounds on his body from her aggressive sexual behavior.
Hitler's drug consumption was too insane to really sustain it over a long period of time, because he was taking so many different things on a daily basis with interactions between the drugs. It is of no surprise that his health deteriorates after a short period of time, actually.
I mean, he was continually sort of experimenting, but it was really once he started giving him not just the Pervitin and the methamphetamine in the earlier stages. It was really when he started to give him Eucodal in 1943 that I think one can talk about a serious addiction.
Eucodal is a so-called opioid, a half-synthetic opiate. You could compare it to heroin. The result is like a mixture of being like on cocaine and heroin at the same time. So you're relaxed and stimulated, and Hitler apparently loved that feeling because he receives Eucodal more than any other opiate.
In 43, he switches to Eucodal. Now, this is at the time, really, of the Battle of Kursk, which was one of the sort of crushing defeats for the Wehrmacht, which came also with the invasion of North Africa and the invasion of Sicily. And Hitler's fear that Mussolini and his regime was going to collapse had really got him into a very nervous state, and this is when Morell decided to inject him with Eucodal for the first time, which of course had quite an element of opium in it.
It dawned on the Führer's headquarters that victory was no longer possible in the East. The Führer was in denial and refused to give up any conquered territory. He started distancing himself from conventional living, and he chose to contain himself where possible in his bunker. In mid-1944, an explosion in the barracks threw Hitler across the room, damaging his ears severely. This assassination attempt was known as Operation Valkyrie.
When the bomb plot of the 20th of July 1944 took place and there was the explosion, Hitler, of course, suffered eardrums imploding and a lot of superficial damage, but he was not actually broken up in the way that some of his entourage, a number of whom were killed.
Well, Morell's being rushed to the scene after the bomb goes off and gives Hitler an injection without writing in his notes what's in the injection. He just writes X. And a few minutes later, hundreds of splinters are removed from Hitler's body, and his perforated eardrums are being treated with an acid, and the doctor who performs these actions writes down that he's completely surprised how little pain Hitler is feeling or how brave he is. He was actually able to meet Mussolini the very same day. Mussolini arrived by train on July 20th, 1944. And Hitler, through Morell's help, I suppose, or at least through an injection that Morell labeled as X, is able to kind of continue working. It would make sense for Morell to also give an opiate at that moment, but he doesn't write it, he just writes X.
He, again boosted by some of Morell's drugs, saw himself as a man of destiny, that somehow Providence had intervened to save him. Everybody who saw Hitler in the latter part of 1944 was shocked to the core on seeing it. The Führer that they remembered, if you like, from the newsreels of the earlier stages of the war, completely gone. Here was an old man looking 20 years older than his age, shuffling around, twitching in many ways. And they could hardly believe what had happened to it. Now, most people thought it was the effect of the bomb plot and the way that he'd been blown up there. But of course, his entourage knew that it was, and of course, the effect of the drugs that he'd been taking as well.
Hitler's drug intake was no longer effective, and his physical deterioration was starting to demotivate others.
And if you've got a character who was already on the spectrum, who was already a sociopath, who was already displaying huge evidence of extreme paranoia and mood swings, the kind of drugs he's taking is only going to make that worse, which is then going to massively affect his decision-making processes as well as his mental and physical state. So the idea that these drugs didn't affect him, didn't make him less effective as a commander-in-chief, whether it be of the armed forces or indeed of the state, clearly they did. They must have done.
The body was, shall we say, wasting away in many ways. And he also, of course, had a skin which was becoming more and more paper-like in a way. And of course, it was the veins, which was Morell's problem.
There are several notes by Morell where he documents discussions he has with Hitler, trying to convince Hitler to take breaks from the daily injections because he can't get the needle into the vein anymore because Hitler's veins were scarred. It shows you the enormous extent of Hitler's drug use.
When you see someone that's been misusing amphetamines across a length of time, you do see that there's a sort of increase in feeling paranoid, persecuted. There's a level of disarray and dangerousness that runs along with continued and sustained use with, larger doses.
So I wouldn't have thought that Hitler's body was a pretty sight at all by that stage.
There was a conflict which I call the Doctor's War, which happened in the fall of 1944. A new doctor comes into headquarters and accuses Morell of poisoning Hitler. And in the beginning, Himmler takes this new doctor's position and they try to get rid of Morell. But when Himmler realizes that Hitler will stand up to his personal physician, Himmler quickly drops his attempts to get rid of Morell. And the other doctor has to leave.
During that particular period, particularly September to December 1944, the only way that Morell could keep him going was by constant injections of Ukadal, and this was having an appalling effect upon him.
Britain began to bomb the pharmaceutical factories of the Reich, which caused great disruption to the manufacture and distribution of Hitler's favorite drugs. Due to supply issues, Morell became ever more fearful for the supply of drugs needed by the Führer.
Morell writes about sending his helpers on motorcycles through bombed-out Berlin from pharmacy to pharmacy to still find drugs, to still be able to hand in the prescriptions and get the medications. And this becomes more and more difficult. Hitler, who before had received anything he wanted and had received the most powerful and euphoric-making substances, now receives drugs that don't make him happy anymore.
Hitler's so-called Nero decree of March the 19th, 1945, was to destroy almost everything which could be of use to the enemy. By that he was thinking, of course, of the Red Army of the Soviet Union. And that meant, of course, the terrible fate for the German civilian population.
The Nero decree is Hitler's order that if Germany is going down, then everyone else is going down with it. So they're going to, it's a scorched earth policy in effect.
He ordered the destruction of every German factory, every building of importance, every cultural heritage site.
So as you retreat, as you pull back, you deny your enemy any of your assets. So you destroy factories, you destroy anything in its wake, even works of art.
But by this stage, Hitler believed that the German people were basically had showed themselves not to be sufficiently strong to resist, and therefore they deserved to die.
He basically ordered the complete destruction of Germany. Well, Hitler fires Morell a few days before he commits suicide and after his last birthday on April 20th. Morell leaves the bunker, devastated, is reported to have wept and kind of lost his senses, and is able to catch one of the last planes out of Berlin, which lands south of Munich.
Hitler's reasons for getting rid of Theodor Morell was that I think he realized that was it. The end was very, very close. Morell could do very little more for him. Hitler was only really at that stage interested in the cyanide capsules, which he was in fact already distributing to some of his colleagues and associates, and particularly the secretaries in the bunker, almost like sort of sweets to be sucked on takeoff to the next world. As far as Hitler was concerned, the end was very, very close. Morell could do no more. And apart from anything else, we probably find that actually Morell had virtually no more drugs to give him by that stage.
I think Hitler's suicide is a combination of internal, actual physical pain, and obviously the external situation.
There are a number of contributory factors, I think, behind Hitler's suicide. He'd always talked of suicide from a very, very early stage. He bitterly criticized General Paulus for refusing to kill himself at Stalingrad when they finally surrendered. But above all, he was probably suffering from withdrawal symptoms, but he hated the idea of being taken alive and being taken back to Moscow in an iron cage. This was his sort of worst nightmare. He was determined to kill himself, interestingly using both poison and a gun at the same time, and then to have his body set on fire so he could not really be recognizable.
Once news of his death became public, many of the Reich's obedient members followed suit. Following the war, Morell was tracked down by a US news reporter, Tanya Long. He was taken to prison following her article and was interrogated and subject to investigation by the US Secret Service.
American investigators write in several reports that they couldn't make sense out of Morell. He was contradicting himself in how he described his job as Hitler's personal physician. Americans kept him for quite a long time, for 2 years, and then dumped him outside the Munich train station. He was quite a big man, and he was wearing a US Army coat that was way too small for him, and he was lying there on the pavement when a half-Jewish Red Cross nurse found him and picked him up and took him to a hospital in Tegernsee, which is in the south of Bavaria. Apparently he did not recover, being incarcerated and interrogated by the Americans for 2 years. He claimed that they tortured him, removed his toenails to extract his secrets. So he dies in summer of '47.
Although the Germans were heavily involved in mass drug consumption during the Second World War, they weren't the only ones. Britain, Japan, and America were also subject to drug highs. One report stated British soldiers were given more than 72 million amphetamine tablets during the course of World War II.
So drugs have been used in conflicts for thousands of years. Just different drugs. I suppose typically alcohol has been the drug people use to get courage and also to come down after fighting, to try to dampen down the stress and the distress.
Drug consumption in Germany during World War II was extremely high, but one has to remember that in almost every war beforehand, alcohol had always played a very large part. I mean, the British issued the rum to the Navy and also to the soldiers before going over the top. It was basically to dull the fear as far as possible. And that was, of course, one of the elements in Pervitin, which gave them a form of euphoria.
One thing that lots of people will be puzzled about when they hear this story, when they hear, wait a minute, all German men between 18 and 30 were taking methamphetamine for years, is surely after the war there were huge numbers of methamphetamine addicts.
It's worth noting in the aftermath of war that the market becomes flooded with Pervitin and methamphetamine.
A lot of that stash ended up on the black markets in Germany after the war, which was the place where you got things because everything else was destroyed. So Pervitin didn't leave the scene. It actually continued to be used after the war. by the people who wanted something to pick them up again.